My name is Nightfall. I'm in my mid-30s now, and I live a life that looks unremarkable from the outside. I work quietly, pay attention to details, and tend to notice patterns other people dismiss as background noise. People often describe me as reserved. Some say gentle, others mistake my calm for passivity. I've learned that being underestimated can be a kind of shelter. For as long as I can remember, there has been a story told about me, usually not by me. It's the version most people accepted without question. In it, I was the younger sibling who needed saving, the one who was raised by an older brother who stepped up when no one else would. According to that story, my stability, my education, even my character were the result of his sacrifice. It was a clean narrative, comforting, easy to repeat, and for a long time I let it stand. This is not a story about anger or revenge. It isn't about exposing someone as a villain or reclaiming attention. It's about something quieter, what happens when a narrative becomes more powerful than the truth, and how that power dissolves, not through confrontation, but through records, paper, dates, signatures, things that don't argue back. Over the next hour, I'll walk you through how a version of my life was slowly constructed around me, how I adapted to it, and how I eventually realized I didn't need to fight it to step out of its shadow. There are no dramatic turning points here, no shouting matches, no public reckoning. The shift happened internally, long before anyone else noticed. I was often seen as lucky, grateful, indebted. Those words followed me into adulthood. At family gatherings, my brother would retell the same story, how he gave up opportunities, how he took responsibility, how he raised me. People nodded. They smiled at me with approval, as if I were living proof of his generosity. I smiled back. Silence was easier than explaining something I hadn't fully examined myself. What I didn't realize then was how much authority lives inside repetition. When a story is told often enough, it stops sounding like a claim and starts sounding like a fact. And once that happens, anyone who questions it risks sounding ungrateful, or worse, unkind. The unraveling didn't begin with conflict. It began with curiosity. A practical need, really. I was applying for something routine, something administrative, and I had to request old-school records, enrollment forms, address histories, emergency contact information, documents no one associates with emotion. They're meant to be neutral, objective, boring. But when I saw them together, laid out across years, they told a story that didn't match the one I'd grown up hearing. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry. I felt something closer to clarity, like finally hearing my own voice in a room that had always been too loud. As I tell this story, I won't dramatize my pain or pretend I was always aware. There were years when I accepted the role that was assigned to me because it was simpler. There were moments when I benefited from being perceived as small. I'll be honest about that too. If you're listening because you've ever been defined by someone else's generosity or by a debt you never agreed to, this story might resonate. Not because our lives are the same, but because the emotional structure is familiar. So before we go any further, let me ask you something, quietly and without accusation. Have you ever realized that the story everyone believed about you was never fully yours? To most people, I was uncomplicated. I was the quiet one. The one who didn't cause trouble, didn't demand attention, didn't need much. At family gatherings, I was introduced with a shorthand explanation that required no follow-up. This is Luna. She's the one my brother raised. Heads would nod, smiles would appear. The story did the work for me, so I didn't have to speak. There's a particular kind of invisibility that comes from being explained before you open your mouth. Not ignored, interpreted, framed, reduced to a supporting detail in someone else's narrative. I learned early that when people already think they understand you, they rarely listen. My brother was older, confident, comfortable speaking in full paragraphs about the past. He had a way of telling stories that sounded generous without sounding self-congratulatory. He never said, "Look what I did." He said, "Someone had to step up." And people filled in the rest on their own. Next to him, I appeared smaller, not physically, but narratively. My presence existed as evidence of his character. I was proof that he was responsible, selfless, and reliable. If I succeeded at something, it reflected well on him. If I struggled, it reinforced how much he had carried. Either way, the meaning of my life didn't quite belong to me. I didn't resent this at first. That's important to say. As a child, I accepted the story because children accept the frameworks they're given. As a teenager, I accepted it because it explained why I should be grateful. Gratitude is a powerful silencer. It makes questioning feel like betrayal. People praised me for being easy, for not asking for much, for being mature beyond my years. They didn't see the quiet calculations behind that behavior, the way I learned to read a room before speaking, to weigh whether my words would disrupt the existing story. Most of the time, they would have. So I stayed agreeable, useful, low maintenance. In school, teachers knew my brother's name before they knew mine. At parent-teacher meetings, his presence stood in for authority. At medical appointments, he was deferred to without question. I learned to sit still, hands folded, answering only when spoken to. It looked like obedience. It was actually an adaptation. As I grew older, the pattern followed me. Friends would hear the story and treat me gently, like someone who had been through something fragile. Employers saw me as steady, dependable, not ambitious. Romantic partners assumed I was used to being led. None of these perceptions was cruel on its own. That's what made them difficult to challenge. There was no single moment when I thought, I am invisible. It was more like realizing you've been standing in the same spot for years while everyone else moves around you, referencing you without really seeing you. At family events, conversations about the past would unfold around me. Decisions about my childhood were discussed as if I weren't present. Dates, places, sacrifices, all narrated confidently. Sometimes details didn't match my memory. Sometimes they did, but with a different emphasis. I noticed, but I didn't interrupt. Because interrupting would require claiming authority over my own experience, and I wasn't sure I was allowed to do that. I became very good at observing, remembering what people said and how they said it. I noticed that my brother rarely spoke about specifics, just outcomes. He talked about responsibility, not logistics, sacrifice, not systems, emotion, not records. At the time, I didn't know why that distinction mattered. I just stored the observation away. If you had asked me then who I was, I would have described myself in relation to others. Someone's sister, someone's responsibility, someone who was taken care of. It wasn't false, but it wasn't complete. The strange thing about being underestimated is that it doesn't always hurt. Sometimes it feels like relief. Expectations are low, pressure is minimal. You're allowed to exist quietly until you're needed. And I was needed often, just never centered. That was who I was to them. Reliable, grateful, secondary. A life summarized in a sentence that wasn't mine. I didn't yet know that invisibility can be temporary, or that stories, no matter how confidently told, leave traces behind them. Traces that wait patiently, whether anyone is looking or not. The first time something felt wrong, it was small enough to dismiss. We were at a casual gathering. Nothing formal, just a family dinner where conversation drifted easily and no one was paying close attention. Someone asked my brother how old I was when he took me in. He answered without hesitation, confidently, like he always did. 8, he said. She was 8, practically a baby. I remember blinking, not because the number mattered, but because it wasn't right. I had been 11, old enough to remember addresses, old enough to remember classrooms, old enough to know the difference between staying somewhere temporarily and being raised there. I almost corrected him. The thought rose instinctively, like a reflex, but before I could speak, the conversation moved on. Someone made a comment about how hard that must have been for him. Someone else shook their head in admiration. The moment closed around me without resistance. I told myself it didn't matter. People round numbers, memories blur. It wasn't worth interrupting dinner over a detail. That's what reasonable people do. They let small inaccuracies go. Except it didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like a compression. A smoothing over of complexity into something simpler, something that made his role larger and mine smaller. That was the first cut. Not deep enough to bleed, just enough to notice. After that, I started hearing them more often. Tiny revisions, subtle shifts. My childhood condensed into a rescue narrative. My agency edited out for clarity. When I mentioned remembering certain things, schools, neighbors, routines, my brother would smile and say, "You were too young to really remember that," always gently. always confidently. And people believed him. Why wouldn't they? He sounded sure. I sounded tentative, even to myself. There's something destabilizing about having your memory questioned in public. Not aggressively, casually, as if the correction is for your benefit, as if someone is helping you remember properly. So I deferred. I laughed it off. I adjusted my language. I started saying things like, I think I remember, or maybe I'm wrong, but each qualifier made my version softer, less solid, and easier to override. No one else seemed to notice. To them, this was harmless storytelling, family mythology, the kind of thing every household does. And maybe that's true, but there's a difference between shared myth and unilateral authorship. I didn't confront him, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't yet have a framework for what was happening. I didn't know how to name it. Without a name, it felt unreasonable to object. Instead, I did what I was good at, I observed. I noticed that his corrections always happened in public, never in private, that he never asked me what I remembered, only replaced it, that the changes always flowed in one direction. His role expanded, mine simplified. The most unsettling part was how easily I adapted. I stopped volunteering memories. I let his version set the tone. When people asked me questions about the past, I answered vaguely, letting them fill in the blanks. It felt efficient, cooperative, polite. But something inside me took note. I began to realize that stories aren't just reflections of reality, they shape it. The more his version circulated, the less space there was for mine. And the more I stayed silent, the more authoritative his voice became by default. I remember going home that night and standing in my kitchen, replaying the conversation. 8. He had said 8. I opened a drawer and found an old photograph, one I'd kept without really knowing why. The date was written on the back in careful handwriting. I did the math. 11. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt unsettled. Because if that detail could be altered so easily, what else could be? That was the moment I stopped assuming alignment. I didn't accuse him of lying. I didn't accuse myself of being mistaken. I simply accepted that our versions of the past were not the same, and that one of them was being repeated far more often. The cut was small, invisible to everyone else. But once you feel it, you start protecting the area around it. You become careful, you listen differently, and you begin to understand that silence, when chosen unconsciously, can slowly become consent. After that first correction, the age, the casual certainty, I started noticing how often my experience was edited in small, socially acceptable ways. Not erased, just adjusted, always subtly, always in the direction that made the story smoother for everyone else. It happened in fragments. Someone would ask about where I went to school before living with my brother. I'd start to answer, and he'd interject with a summary that skipped over details. She bounced around a bit, he'd say. It wasn't stable. That wasn't untrue, but it wasn't complete either. The places I remembered, the routines I'd built, the teachers who knew my name, those didn't fit neatly into the narrative of rescue. I learned to let him finish. Over time, this became normal. Not comfortable, but familiar. And familiarity has a way of dulling your response. You stop reacting to things that once made you pause. You tell yourself it's not worth the energy. You tell yourself that other people have it worse. You tell yourself that keeping the peace is a form of maturity. I became very good at that kind of reasoning. When he corrected my memory, I assumed good intent. When he spoke over me, I assumed enthusiasm. When he dismissed a detail I offered, I assumed he remembered it better. After all, he was older. He sounded sure. Confidence often masquerades as accuracy. And there was something else too. Something harder to admit. Staying quiet had benefits. The story protected me from expectations. People didn't push me to explain myself or justify my choices. They didn't question my pace or my preferences. I was the one who had been helped, not the one who had to lead. So I adapted my identity to fit the frame. I became careful with language. I started using phrases that aligned with his version. Back then, when things were rough, before everything stabilized, vague words that couldn't be challenged, words that smoothed over edges. It felt collaborative, like co-authoring something that already existed. But co-authoring implies shared authority, and that wasn't what this was. The disrespect wasn't loud, it was procedural. It showed up in who answered questions, who received thanks, and who was consulted about decisions related to my life. It showed up in assumptions that I'd defer, that I wouldn't mind, that I was used to it. And the more it happened, the more I began to preempt it myself. If I was invited somewhere, I checked with him first, not because I needed permission, but because I didn't want to disrupt expectations. If someone praised my independence, I redirected it toward him. I had a lot of help, I'd say. It sounded gracious. It also reinforced the story. What surprised me most was how little anyone questioned this dynamic. Not because people are malicious, but because systems run smoothly when no one resists them. Everyone knew their role. Mine was to be grateful. He was to be credited. There were moments when the imbalance felt sharp enough to acknowledge, like when someone joked that I owed him everything. And everyone laughed, including me. Laughter is a powerful solvent. It dissolves discomfort before it can harden into insight. I told myself I was choosing peace, that correcting people would only create tension, that the past was over anyway. That insistence on precision was petty. These explanations stacked neatly, one on top of the other, until they formed something like a moral argument against speaking up. And so the disrespect normalized, not because it escalated, but because I adapted to it. The danger of normalization is that it feels like stability. You stop asking whether something is right and start asking whether it's manageable. I wasn't miserable. I was functional. That felt like enough. But beneath that functionality, something else was happening. I was learning to watch without reacting, to track patterns, to notice inconsistencies without naming them out loud. It wasn't intentional at first. It was just what my mind did when it stopped trusting the surface explanation. I noticed how often gratitude was demanded but never examined, how the story never included uncertainty or limits, how no one ever asked what I remembered, only whether I appreciated what I'd been given. That question, "Do you appreciate it?" became the boundary. As long as I answered yes, everything stayed smooth. As long as I performed gratitude, no one looked closer. And for a long time, I answered yes. Honestly, I was grateful for many things, but gratitude, I began to realize, is not the same as consent. It doesn't authorize someone to own your narrative indefinitely. Still, I stayed quiet, because staying quiet had become a habit. And habits don't announce themselves as choices until you try to break them. I didn't yet know that my silence was no longer just protective. It was instructional. It was teaching everyone around me how much of myself I was willing to give up to keep the story intact. It took me a long time to realize that I wasn't just being misunderstood. I was being cast. Not in a cruel way, not deliberately. Roles don't always require villains or intent. Sometimes they form because they're convenient, because they simplify relationships, because everyone benefits from the clarity they provide. And once a role works, it gets reinforced quietly, over and over, until stepping outside it feels disruptive. Mine was simple. I was the reliable one, the grateful one, the proof that someone else had done the right thing. People came to me when they needed something done, not when they needed something decided. I was asked to help organize, to assist, to support. I wasn't asked to lead or to challenge. My compliance was assumed long before I agreed to anything. In my family, this showed up in subtle ways. Plans were made around me, not with me. My availability was treated as the default. My preferences were considered optional. If I declined something, there was surprise, not anger, just confusion, like a system encountering an unexpected input. My brother never told me what to do. He didn't have to. The structure was already in place. When he spoke, people listened. When I spoke, people waited to see if it aligned with what he'd already said. I noticed how often I was described using a function rather than an identity. She's good at handling things. She's low maintenance. She doesn't need much. These weren't insults. They were compliments that carried expectations inside them. Expectations to remain easy, to remain small. At work, the same pattern repeated. I was trusted with details, with follow-through, with continuity. I was the one who remembered policies, archived decisions, and maintained records. People relied on me without fully seeing me. It felt familiar, safe, even. What I didn't realize at first was how deeply the role had settled into my own thinking. I stopped imagining myself as someone who could change the narrative. I thought of myself as someone who existed within it, someone who maintained it. I told myself that visibility wasn't important, that impact didn't require recognition. There's truth in that. But it can also be a convenient way to avoid risk. The role rewarded me for staying where I was. It gave me praise without authority, appreciation without autonomy. It made my presence valuable, but my voice optional. And because I performed the role well, no one questioned whether it suited me. The clearest moment came during a conversation that wasn't even about the past. Someone asked my brother how I'd turned out so grounded. He laughed and said, "She had to grow up fast. I made sure of that." It was said lightly, like a joke. People laughed. I smiled automatically. Then something inside me paused. "I made sure of that." The phrase echoed. Not because it was cruel, but because it revealed something I hadn't fully acknowledged. In his version of events, I was a result, an outcome, not a participant. That was the role. I began to see how often decisions about my life had been narrated as decisions for my life. How the agency had been implied rather than granted. How my compliance had been mistaken for agreement. Still, I didn't confront him. I didn't announce a boundary. I didn't reject the role outright. That would have required a different kind of energy, one I didn't yet have. Instead, I started doing something quieter. I stopped performing gratitude on cue, not dramatically, just slightly. I didn't correct the story, but I didn't embellish it either. I answered questions directly. I let pauses sit without filling them. When people looked to my brother to answer for me, I waited to see if anyone would notice. Most didn't, but I noticed something else. When I stopped reinforcing the role, it didn't collapse. It just continued without me. People kept assigning me the same expectations, assuming the same compliance. That was the moment I understood that roles don't disappear just because you stop believing in them. They persist until something structural changes. And that was the first time I considered the possibility that if I wanted to step out of the role, I wouldn't be able to do it emotionally. I would have to do it systemically. I didn't yet know how. I only knew that I was done being useful without being visible. The shift didn't happen during an argument or a dramatic revelation. There was no raised voice, no ultimatum, no moment where I finally stood up for myself. If anything, it happened in silence. So ordinary it almost felt like nothing at all. I was sitting alone in a waiting room. It was one of those administrative buildings with neutral colours and outdated magazines. I was there for something routine, something that required identity verification and historical information. The kind of errand you don't think about emotionally. I had brought a folder with me, old habit, copies of documents just in case. The clerk asked a simple question. "Do you have proof of residence from that period?" I did. I handed it over without thinking. She glanced at it, nodded and continued typing. No commentary, no reaction, just process. And in that moment, something inside me realigned. Because for the first time, my past was being acknowledged by someone who had no emotional investment in the story I'd grown up with. No admiration for my brother, no expectations of gratitude from me, just facts being checked against criteria. The document listed an address, a date range, a guardian's name. Not his. I watched as the clerk matched it against another form. Everything aligned cleanly, efficiently. There was no drama in the confirmation, but it landed with weight. I felt a strange calm. Not anger, not vindication, certainty. I realized then that the reason I'd always felt unsettled by the story wasn't that it was unkind. It was because it was imprecise, and imprecision had allowed it to grow beyond its boundaries. Sitting there, I understood something else. I had spent years treating my own memory as suspect because it conflicted with someone else's confidence. But memory isn't the only form of evidence, and it's not even the strongest. That was the shift, not toward confrontation, but toward validation. Not from others, from myself. I didn't rush home to dig through boxes or demand explanations. I didn't rehearse arguments or imagine outcomes. I simply acknowledged quietly that there was a version of my life that existed independently of the story I'd been living inside. And that version could be verified. From that day on, my relationship with silence changed. Before, it had been reactive, something I defaulted to in order to avoid friction. Now, it has become deliberate. I stopped thinking of quiet as absence and started thinking of it as space. Space to observe without correcting, space to gather without announcing, space to let people continue speaking while I listened for patterns rather than intent. I began to notice how often my brother referenced effort rather than responsibility. How frequently he spoke about stepping in, but rarely about systems already in place. He remembered emotions vividly, but details vaguely. I didn't challenge him. I didn't need to. I had stopped measuring truth by tone. What surprised me most was how little my external behavior changed. I still attended gatherings. I still listened politely. I still fulfilled expectations. But internally, the axis had shifted. I was no longer asking myself whether my memory was flawed. I was asking what evidence existed. That question changed everything. It reframed the past as something that could be examined rather than endured. It turned confusion into curiosity. And curiosity, I learned, is far more powerful than indignation. I started keeping track, not obsessively, just methodically. When stories were told, I noted what was emphasized and what was omitted. When dates were mentioned, I remembered them. When assumptions were made, I didn't rush to correct them. The waiting room moment didn't give me a plan. It gave me permission. Permission to stop negotiating my own reality. Permission to let the truth unfold on its own terms, through its own mechanisms. I walked out of that building unchanged to the casual observer. But I wasn't the same person who had walked in. Something fundamental had settled into place. I no longer felt the need to be seen immediately. I was willing to wait. After that day, silence stopped happening to me. I chose it, not out of fear and not out of politeness, but because it created a kind of leverage no one else seemed to notice. When you stop explaining yourself, people reveal how much they've been filling in on your behalf. I didn't announce this change. I didn't draw boundaries in bold lines. I simply stopped volunteering information that would be misused or reshaped. When people asked questions, I answered precisely and then stopped. No qualifiers, no emotional padding. It made some people uncomfortable. They were used to me smoothing things over, offering context, helping them understand. Without that, conversations stalled. People filled the gaps themselves, often with assumptions that had nothing to do with me. I let them. My brother, especially, mistook my quiet for compliance. He continued telling the story as he always had, confident that I wouldn't interrupt. And he was right. I didn't. But something else had changed. I was no longer listening as a participant. I was listening as an archivist. I paid attention to phrasing, to inconsistencies, to what he said when he thought no one was questioning him. The absence of challenge made him comfortable. Comfort breeds carelessness. He repeated himself more often. Details drifted. Timelines blurred. What had once sounded solid began to sound rehearsed. I didn't point it out. I didn't need to. I was no longer trying to win a moment. I was watching a pattern. Others interpreted my silence the same way they always had. As softness, as gratitude, as acceptance. Some even praised me for it. She's so understanding, they'd say. She doesn't hold grudges. I let those interpretations stand. They weren't useful to correct. In private, though, I was making choices. I began requesting records, not dramatically, just as needed. School transcripts, enrollment forms, and address histories. Things I was entitled to, but had never thought to ask for. Each request was practical, justified by some neutral reason. No one questioned it. I didn't tell anyone what I was collecting. There was no secrecy, just discretion. I wasn't hiding. I simply wasn't narrating. The more I gathered, the clearer something became. My silence had been mistaken for ignorance. People assumed I didn't know because I didn't speak. They didn't consider that I might be listening for a different purpose. That assumption protected me. My brother continued to correct others with confidence. He spoke about sacrifice in broad strokes, about stepping in when it mattered. But when pressed for specifics, he shifted topics, or laughed, or generalized. No one pushed him. They didn't need to. The story was familiar, comfortable. I watched how often people deferred to him without asking me a single question. How rarely anyone checked sources when the narrative felt morally satisfying. It taught me something important. Truth doesn't spread because it's accurate. It spreads because it's easy. Silence, in contrast, is demanding. It asks people to sit with uncertainty. Most won't. There were moments when I felt the urge to speak up, to correct a date, to clarify a role, but each time, I asked myself what speaking would accomplish right now. Would it change the structure, or just create friction? Would it be heard, or absorbed and reinterpreted? The answer was almost always the same, so I waited. Silence became a filter. It let me see who was invested in understanding me versus who was invested in preserving the story. Very few crossed that line. I also noticed how my own emotions changed. Without the constant need to manage others' perceptions, I felt steadier, less reactive. I wasn't suppressing anger, I wasn't generating it in the first place. Distance had given me clarity. The most revealing part was how quickly people assumed I was still exactly where they'd left me. That nothing had changed internally, that I was static. They didn't realize that by saying less, I was learning more. That every unchallenged statement was another data point. That every assumption confirmed without evidence made the eventual reckoning, not emotional, but factual, inevitable. Silence, when chosen, is not empty. It's a container, and I was filling it carefully. What they never noticed was how methodical I am. That's not something people associate with someone who stays quiet. They imagine hesitation, uncertainty, maybe even confusion. What they don't imagine is patience with direction, observation with purpose. I didn't wake up one day and decide to prove anything. There was no checklist titled "Expose the Truth." What I did instead was lean into what I already knew how to do: organize, verify, and cross-reference. It started with one request. I needed a school transcript for a routine application. Then another, enrollment confirmation from a different year. Each request led naturally to the next. Addresses didn't line up with the story I'd been told. Guardian names shifted over time. Emergency contact cards told their own quiet truths. I treated each document the same way I would treat any professional task. No assumptions, no conclusions in advance, just data. I created a timeline, not the emotional kind, the factual one. Dates, locations, institutions. I noted when I lived where, who was legally responsible, and who signed what. I wasn't trying to catch anyone in a lie. I was trying to understand the structure of my own life without interpretation layered on top. The more I gathered, the clearer the shape became. There were long stretches where my brother was present in my life, but not in the role he claimed. There were systems already in place, school administrators, extended family, social services, that carried more responsibility than his story ever acknowledged. His involvement existed, but it was intermittent. Supportive, yes. Defining, no. I didn't feel betrayed by this realization. I felt oddly relieved. It meant my memory wasn't fractured. It meant my sense of unease had been reasonable. While all of this was happening externally, nothing changed. I still attended gatherings. I still listened. My brother still told the same story, and because I didn't challenge him, he grew more confident in it. He filled in gaps with assumptions. He conflated years. He spoke about himself as if he'd been the sole axis of my stability. He never noticed that I stopped reacting, that I no longer smiled at the familiar lines, that I didn't laugh at the jokes about sacrifice, that I didn't reinforce the narrative with my own words. To him, my quiet was continuity. What he also never noticed was how others began to change subtly around me. Not in allegiance, just in tone. When I stopped embellishing the story, people asked fewer follow-up questions. Some seemed uncertain about which version to hold. Silence had introduced doubt, even without contradiction. I also positioned myself carefully. I didn't share what I was learning, but I made sure I understood the implications. Which documents held legal weight, which were considered secondary, which could be requested by me alone, which were public records. I learned the language institutions use when they are being precise. This wasn't about confrontation, it was about preparedness. Because I understood something my brother didn't. Narratives collapse not when they're challenged emotionally, but when they encounter systems that don't recognize them. A story can survive disagreement. It can't survive paperwork. I kept everything organized, labeled, indexed. Not obsessively, cleanly. I didn't reread the documents for emotional validation. I read them to ensure coherence. And there it was, coherence. The life I remembered made sense on paper. The life that had been narrated over me did not. Still, I waited. There was no urgency. Truth doesn't spoil. It matures. I watched my brother continue to claim authorship over my past. I watched others nod along, and I felt no need to intervene because I understood now that intervention would be premature. What they never noticed was that I had stopped needing their agreement, that I wasn't gathering proof to win an argument. I was gathering it to reclaim authorship. And authorship, once claimed, doesn't require announcement. It simply shows up when it's needed. The moment of realization didn't arrive all at once. There was no single document that changed everything. No line highlighted in red. No dramatic discovery that made me sit back and whisper, "So this is it." Instead, clarity emerged the way it often does in real life, gradually, through accumulation. One document confirmed a date, another confirmed a residence, a third established legal responsibility during a period that, according to the story I'd grown up with, was supposedly undefined. Each piece alone was unremarkable. Together, they formed something undeniable. What I had been calling my brother's role was on paper a supporting one. Present, yes. Helpful at times, but not primary, not exclusive, not foundational in the way his version required it to be. I laid everything out one evening on my dining table. Not dramatically, methodically. Documents aligned by year, addresses matched to school districts, guardianship lines traced without interpretation. It looked less like a revelation and more like an audit. And that's exactly what it was. The private reveal wasn't emotional. That surprised me. I had expected anger, maybe grief, a sense of betrayal. But what I felt instead was something calmer and more stable. Orientation. Like realizing you've been walking with a slight tilt for years and suddenly standing straight. Not because someone corrected you, but because the ground finally leveled. The leverage wasn't power over him. That's important to say. It wasn't the ability to shame, embarrass, or contradict him publicly. It was something far quieter. I now knew where authority actually lived. It lived in institutions that didn't care about intention, in records that didn't adjust themselves to sound generous, in timelines that either aligned or didn't. And more importantly, I knew I didn't need to use that leverage unless it became necessary. That was the clarity. I had spent years thinking the only way out of the narrative was through confrontation, through emotional exposure, through asking people to believe me over him. That path had always felt exhausting, risky, and uncertain. Now I understand there was another option. I could let the story continue until it intersected with reality in a context where emotion had no jurisdiction. That realization changed how I carried myself. Not visibly, but internally. I no longer felt defensive when my brother spoke. I no longer felt the urge to correct him. His words had lost their authority over me. Because authority, I learned, isn't claimed, it's recognized. And I knew exactly where recognition would fall, if it ever came to that. I didn't tell anyone what I'd discovered. Not friends, not family, not even people I trusted. This wasn't secrecy born of fear. It was restraint born of understanding. Once something is spoken aloud, it becomes social. It invites opinion, distortion, reaction. I wasn't ready for that, and I didn't need it. This knowledge was for me. I noticed how often people confuse silence with indecision. In truth, silence often follows resolution. Once you've decided something internally, there's very little left to say. The private reveal also forced me to confront my own complicity. There were moments when I could have spoken sooner, times when my silence made the story easier to maintain. I didn't punish myself for that. I acknowledged it. Adaptation isn't a weakness, it's survival. But survival doesn't have to be permanent. I folded the documents back into their folder and placed it where I could reach it easily, but not where I would see it every day. I didn't want to live inside proof. I wanted to live knowing it existed. From that point on, everything felt lighter. Not because anything had changed externally, but because I no longer felt obligated to manage a lie I hadn't created. I wasn't waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. I was waiting to see whether revealing it would even be necessary. Sometimes the most powerful shift isn't what you say, it's knowing that you don't have to. That was the private reveal, not a weapon, a compass. Once clarity settles in, you reach a crossroads, whether you want to or not. I knew the facts, I knew the structure, I knew where the story bent and where it broke, and with that knowledge came options. More than I'd ever had before. That in itself was unsettling. I could confront my brother privately. Sit him down, show him the documents, and ask for acknowledgement. That path promised emotional resolution, maybe even reconciliation. It also required vulnerability, trusting that he would respond with honesty rather than defensiveness. I wasn't ready to gamble on that. I could correct the story publicly. Speak up at the next gathering, clarify dates, reclaim my narrative out loud. That path would be immediate and visible. It would also turn my life into a debate, invite sides, and force people to choose versions of the past like teams. I had no interest in becoming a topic. I could do nothing. Let the story persist indefinitely. Live with the quiet certainty of knowing the truth without ever acting on it. That option was tempting. It promised peace through detachment, but it also meant accepting a future shaped by a lie, one that could surface in places where it actually mattered. And then there was the last option. I could make a choice that didn't require permission, explanation, or agreement. One that aligned my life structurally with the truth, regardless of what anyone said about the past. That option was irreversible. I realized that as long as my brother's version of history framed my dependency, it also framed my present. It shaped how others interpreted my autonomy, my decisions, and my credibility. If I wanted to step fully out of that shadow, I needed to do something that redefined my position, not emotionally, but concretely. So I chose to change the context in which the story could operate. I began planning a transition that had nothing to do with him on the surface. Career advancement, financial independence, legal autonomy, things adults do every day without announcement. But for me, it was a boundary drawn in infrastructure rather than words. I didn't discuss it. I didn't hint. I didn't ask for advice. I moved quietly, deliberately, making decisions that would stand even if no one ever knew why they mattered. This wasn't about proving I didn't need him. It was about ensuring that no one could ever credibly claim I did. The decision felt heavy, not because it was wrong, but because it was final. Once taken, there would be no returning to the old equilibrium, no slipping back into the role of the grateful recipient, no benefit of the doubt offered by proximity. I understood that choosing this path meant letting go of a certain kind of protection, the kind that comes from being perceived as small, from being underestimated. I had used that shield for a long time. Setting it down felt like exposure, but it also felt honest. I didn't rush. I verified each step. I made sure that what I was building didn't depend on emotional outcomes, only on execution. The moment I committed internally, something surprising happened. The urgency disappeared. I wasn't anxious. I wasn't eager. I wasn't waiting for a reaction. I had chosen. And once chosen, the past lost its grip on the present. The story could continue being told. It didn't matter anymore. I was stepping into a life where that story had no jurisdiction. That was the irreversible choice. Not to confront, not to correct, but to outgrow the frame entirely. Once the decision was made, the work became almost peaceful. There's a particular calm that comes after commitment. When you're no longer weighing options, no longer rehearsing conversations that may never happen. You stop asking what if and start asking what's next. That's where I was. I moved quietly, but not cautiously. The first changes were administrative. On paper, nothing dramatic. Just updates, registrations, confirmations. I reviewed accounts I'd left untouched for years. I separated what had always been loosely shared. I ensured that my name stood alone where it mattered. None of this required confrontation. Institutions don't ask why when the request is valid. They don't ask about family history or emotional context. They respond to forms, signatures, and compliance. I learned to appreciate that neutrality. Financially, I consolidated. I simplified. I made sure there were no assumptions baked into my stability, no invisible dependencies that could later be framed as generosity. It wasn't about cutting ties, it was about clarity. At work, I accepted an opportunity I'd previously deferred. Not because I wasn't capable, but because it would have required stepping into visibility. This time, I didn't hesitate. I let my record speak. Years of quiet competence translated easily into trust once I allowed it to. No one connected these shifts to my brother. They didn't see a rebellion or a withdrawal. From the outside, it looked like a natural progression. Responsible adulthood, timely growth. That invisibility was intentional. I didn't want my actions interpreted as a reaction. I wanted them to stand on their own. So I kept my demeanor the same, calm, polite, unremarkable. I didn't announce milestones, I didn't seek validation. And because I didn't frame my movement as a departure, no one tried to stop me. My brother continued as before. He spoke about the past with the same confidence. He assumed proximity equaled influence. That assumption wasn't malicious, it was habitual. He didn't notice that I stopped asking for help I'd never needed, that I no longer deferred out of courtesy, that I made decisions without looping him in, not as defiance, but as default. The silence made it seamless. What I found most interesting was how systems responded once I stepped fully into my own lane. Things that had once felt complicated resolved quickly. Requests were processed, boundaries held, authority followed responsibility. It reinforced something I'd long suspected. Dependency narratives persist not because they're accurate, but because they're convenient. Once you remove the need, the story loses traction. I also made sure my documentation was current, complete, and accessible. To me. Not hidden, not dramatized, simply ready. Preparedness has a quiet confidence to it. You don't need to threaten with it. You just need to know it's there. Emotionally, I felt steadier than I ever had. Not lighter, steadier. I wasn't carrying resentment or anticipation. I wasn't waiting for a moment to reveal anything. I was building a life that didn't require explanation. People around me noticed something had changed, but they couldn't name it. They commented on how settled I seemed, how self-directed. Some assumed it was time, others credited maturity. No one suspected a strategy. That's the advantage of moving in silence. When your actions don't contradict expectations loudly, they slip past resistance. By the time anyone realizes the structure has changed, it's already solid. I didn't feel triumphant. Triumph requires an audience. This didn't. I felt aligned. The story about my brother raising me still existed in conversation. But now it floated, untethered, unable to attach itself to my present reality. It had become what it always should have been, a story people told, not a truth that governed my life. And still I said nothing, because I knew the next phase wouldn't begin with a declaration. It would begin with absence. The consequences didn't arrive with confrontation. They arrived in confusion. At first, it was subtle. Small moments where expectations no longer landed where they used to. A request went unanswered. Not because I ignored it, but because it was never made directly to me. An assumption failed quietly. A plan stalled. People began to notice gaps. My brother noticed first, though not consciously. He still spoke with the same authority, but the results were different. When he referenced my availability, I wasn't automatically there. When he spoke on my behalf, there was no follow-through. Not refusal, just absence. He adjusted at first, rephrased, filled in, assumed timing issues. He didn't connect the dots because there was no dramatic trigger to connect them to. From the outside, it looked like life had simply become more complicated. Others began to feel it too. Extended family members reached out, expecting the same responsiveness, the same emotional labor, the same quiet reliability. When I didn't step in to smooth things over, they felt the friction for the first time. No one blamed me outright. They were confused, not angry. Confusion is uncomfortable. It forces people to confront the mechanics they've taken for granted. I watched carefully. I noticed how quickly people tried to reassign responsibility back to my brother, and how little capacity he actually had to absorb it. The role he'd narrated was larger than the one he'd ever practiced. Without me quietly compensating, the edges showed. That wasn't my intention, but it was inevitable. What struck me most was how often people expressed loss without naming it. Things feel different, they'd say. You've changed. Not accusatory, observational, as if they were trying to understand a shift in gravity. I didn't explain, because explanations invite negotiation, and there was nothing left to negotiate. My brother, sensing the change, became more assertive in his storytelling. He emphasized sacrifice more strongly. He referenced the past more often. It was as if reinforcing the narrative might restore the structure it once supported. But narratives don't generate capacity, they only describe it. And capacity, once withdrawn, doesn't return out of loyalty. I noticed moments of quiet frustration from him. Pauses where he expected my agreement and didn't get it. Situations where he realized, too late, that he no longer had default access to my time, my labor, my emotional buffering. Still, I said nothing. The most telling reactions came from people who had benefited indirectly from my role. They missed the ease I provided, the way things used to just work. Some reached out more insistently, others pulled back, uncertain. Very few asked what I needed. That answered a question I hadn't realized I was still carrying. I wasn't watching this unfold with satisfaction. There was no sense of finally. What I felt instead was confirmation. The structure had depended on me far more than anyone acknowledged. Removing myself revealed that truth without accusation. The story about my brother raising me still circulated, but it no longer produced results. People felt the absence of something they couldn't name, and that absence made the story feel thinner. You can't lean on a myth once the support beam is gone. What I learned during this phase was simple and sobering. When you stop maintaining a system, people don't miss you. They miss what you provided without recognition. And that's when you know the change is real. Because no one can ask you to return to a role they never admitted you were playing. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, it was already embedded. The confusion that had hovered quietly began to sharpen. Not into anger, into urgency. People started asking questions that weren't really questions at all. They were attempts to restore a pattern that had stopped responding. My brother was the last to understand and the most affected. At first, he framed the changes as temporary. Stress, a phase. He spoke about me as if I were briefly unavailable rather than fundamentally repositioned. He reassured others, and himself, that things would settle back into place. They didn't. Requests that once passed through me now stall. Information that I used to supply without being asked was suddenly missing. Decisions that relied on my quiet coordination were delayed or made poorly. The system began to show strain. That's when the panic started. Not loud panic, controlled, almost polite. My brother began reaching out more often, asking questions that assumed continuity. Can you handle this? You're good with these things. Each message carried an expectation that no longer existed. I responded when appropriate. Briefly, specifically, without filling gaps. The difference unsettled him. He started referencing the past more directly in conversations with others, emphasizing how much he'd done, how much responsibility he'd carried. It was as if reminding people of the story might restore the authority it once gave him. But authority doesn't come from memory. It comes from presence. And I was no longer present in the way he needed. I could see the regret forming before it was ever spoken. Not regret for the story itself, but for the reliance he hadn't realized he had. He'd grown accustomed to a version of me that absorbed complexity quietly. Without that, his own limits became visible. There were moments when he seemed on the verge of asking me directly what had changed, but each time, he stopped short. That question would have required acknowledging that the dynamic itself was real, and that he hadn't been fully aware of it. Instead, he tried to fix things indirectly, offering help I didn't need, reasserting closeness, speaking with a familiarity that assumed access. It didn't work, because what had changed wasn't emotional distance, it was structural independence. By then, there was nothing to reverse. No conversation could restore the old equilibrium. No apology that could rebuild a role that no longer fits. People began to sense that something fundamental had shifted. Some interpreted it as conflict, others as growth, a few as abandonment. None of those interpretations were entirely accurate. The truth was simpler. I had stopped holding up a structure that wasn't mine to maintain. The most difficult moment came when I realized that even if my brother had acknowledged everything, every exaggeration, every assumption, it wouldn't have changed my decision. The past was no longer the issue. The present was already built. That's when I understood what irreversibility really means. It doesn't mean punishment. It doesn't mean severance. It means the old path no longer exists. There was a quiet grief in that realization. Not for what was lost, but for what had never been named while it was happening. For the version of our relationship that might have been possible if things had been more honest earlier. But grief doesn't require reversal. It requires acceptance. My brother eventually stopped trying to correct the system. He adjusted to the loss without fully understanding it. People always do. Humans are adaptable, even when clarity never arrives. The story about him raising me still surfaces sometimes, but now it lands differently. Without reinforcement, without results, it sounds like what it always was, an interpretation, not a foundation. By the time anyone thought to ask whether it was accurate, the answer no longer mattered, because the life it once explained no longer existed. The conversation, when it finally happened, was almost anticlimactic. No raised voices, no accusations, no dramatic unveiling of documents across a table, just two adults sitting across from each other in a quiet space, with enough history between them to make excess emotion unnecessary. My brother asked if we could talk. He didn't frame it as a confrontation. He framed it as concern. He said I seemed distant, different. He asked if he'd done something wrong. His tone was careful, almost cautious, like someone stepping onto unfamiliar ground. I listened. That alone surprised him. For years, our conversations had followed a pattern. He explained. I acknowledged. This time, I let him finish without interrupting, without softening his words, without reassuring him. When he stopped speaking, the silence stayed. Not tense, just present. Finally, he asked, did I misunderstand? Stand something. It was the first time he'd left space for that possibility. I answered simply. I said I had been revisiting parts of my past for practical reasons. In doing so, I'd gained clarity about certain timelines and responsibilities, that I wasn't angry, and I wasn't trying to correct anyone publicly, but I had adjusted my life to reflect what I now understood to be true. I didn't mention documents. I didn't list discrepancies. I didn't challenge his memory. I spoke about the present. I told him I was no longer comfortable being spoken for. I preferred to be asked directly, that I needed my independence to be assumed, not granted. He listened, but I could see the struggle behind his eyes, the effort it took to reconcile this version of me with the one he'd always known, with the one who deferred, the one who absorbed. He started to say something about everything he'd done. Then he stopped himself. That pause mattered more than any apology. I didn't deny his efforts. I didn't invalidate his feelings. I simply said that support doesn't translate into authorship, that care doesn't require control, and that gratitude doesn't mean permanence. There was no argument to win, no villain to expose. Just a boundary, stated without heat. He nodded slowly. Not in agreement, at least not fully, but in recognition that something had changed beyond negotiation. That whatever story he'd been telling, it no longer applied to the person sitting in front of him. We ended the conversation without resolution in the traditional sense. No promises, no dramatic closure. Just an understanding that the dynamic we'd known was over. As I left, I felt calm. Not relieved, not vindicated. Calm. Because confrontation, when done without heat, doesn't burn bridges. It redraws maps. And that was all I'd needed. I'm often asked now whether I feel different. The honest answer is yes, but not in the way people expect. I don't feel hardened or distant. I don't feel triumphant. I feel aligned, as if the version of myself I move through the world as now finally matches the one I'd always been internally. I no longer introduce myself in relation to anyone else. Not out of defiance, but because it's unnecessary. My history exists, but it doesn't lead with explanation anymore. I let my present do that work. The most noticeable change is how I make decisions. I don't check them against anticipated reactions. I don't preemptively justify my choices. If something matters to me, that's sufficient reason to pursue it. If it doesn't, I let it go without guilt. This simplicity took years to earn. My relationship with my brother is quieter now, more neutral. There's space where there used to be an assumption. We speak occasionally, politely. There's no hostility, but there's also no illusion. We exist as two adults with shared history, not as a narrative in motion. That's enough. I've learned that independence isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself or demand recognition. It shows up in small, consistent ways, in how you structure your life, how you respond to requests, how you let silence stand without rushing to fill it. I still value compassion. I still believe in acknowledging help when it's given, but I no longer confuse gratitude with obligation. One can exist without the other. What surprises me most is how much energy I have now. Not because my life is easier, but because it's clearer. I'm no longer carrying the weight of managing a story that doesn't fit. I'm no longer editing myself to maintain someone else's comfort. Clarity creates capacity. I also notice how differently people respond to me. Not everyone, but enough to matter. When I speak, I'm listened to. When I pause, it's respected. The shift isn't dramatic, it's cumulative, built on consistency rather than declaration. And when the old story surfaces, as it still sometimes does, I don't rush to correct it. I don't feel the need. The people who matter see me as I am now. The rest are responding to a version of the past that no longer has influence. That used to bother me. It doesn't anymore, because I understand something I didn't before. Being understood is not a prerequisite for being free. Alignment is. I don't resent the years I spent being underestimated. They taught me patience. They sharpened my attention. They showed me the difference between noise and structure. I also don't regret staying quiet as long as I did. I spoke when it mattered, when my words could be received without distortion. Timing is a form of wisdom, even if it looks like hesitation from the outside. Who I am now is not defined by what I corrected, but by what I chose to build. A life that stands on its own. A voice that doesn't compete. A past that informs without controlling. That's enough for me. There's a reason I wanted to tell this story all the way through, instead of stopping at the reveal or the confrontation. Because the point was never that my brother was wrong. The point was that stories, once repeated enough, begin to replace reality, not through malice, but through convenience. People like clean arcs, heroes, gratitude. They prefer narratives that resolve emotional discomfort quickly. And when someone fits neatly into a supporting role, that role can harden before anyone thinks to ask whether it was chosen, including the person inside it. What I learned is this: you don't lose yourself all at once. You lose yourself in edits, in small omissions, in other people speaking for you just this once, in gratitude that slowly turns into expectation, in silence that begins as kindness and ends as consent. And the reversal doesn't happen all at once either. It happens when you stop trying to win your story back and start living beyond it. I didn't expose anyone. I didn't demand validation. I didn't rewrite the past in public. I aligned my life with the truth quietly and let the old narrative become irrelevant on its own. That's what quiet dominance really is. Not overpowering someone, not humiliating them, not forcing acknowledgement. It's knowing where reality actually lives and choosing to stand there calmly until everything else has to adjust. Documentation didn't give me power. It gave me orientation. Silence didn't make me invisible. It made me unreadable to people who relied on assumptions. And independence didn't come from rejection. It came from structure. If there's a moral here, it's not don't trust people or always fight back. It's this: you are not required to carry a story that costs you your agency, no matter how generously it's told. You are allowed to outgrow narratives without burning bridges. And sometimes the most ethical response isn't correction, it's repositioning. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of yourself, being the reliable one, the grateful one, the one whose past is always summarized by someone else, I hope you take this gently. You don't owe anyone permanent access to your life because they helped you once. Support does not equal ownership, and silence, when chosen consciously, can be the beginning of authorship. I'll leave you with one question, not to provoke, but to reflect. Have you ever stepped out of a role without announcing it, and noticed how differently the world treated you once you did? If you're comfortable, I'd love to hear your experience in the comments. And thank you for listening all the way to the end.